All right, we'd like to welcome you to session F1, Essential Features of Tier 2 Supports and Lessons from District-Wide Implementation. I know we still have people joining the session, and I know it'll take a couple of minutes, but as we're the first session in the Tier 2 strand, we have some introductory slides, some expectations and rules to go over, and so we'll take a few minutes to go over some of that, and then we'll do introductions for you. So quick reminder of virtual forum expectations. I know that many of you have already joined sessions across yesterday and then the opening today, but a couple quick reminders in terms of being responsible. Completing the session evaluation will be really key today. We look forward to your feedback and working on a shared action plan with your team. When we think about chat, we can't wait to see positive on-topic comments related to Tier 2, and we will touch base in just a minute on the poll tab. Again, if you need to get up, take a break, whatever that might be, the session will be recorded and it will be posted for access later. We look forward to all of us being safe in the chat and engaging in a productive dialogue. I know that there's a lot of great things to talk about related to Tier 2, and we're going to pose some chat questions as well. One thing that we want to think about within navigating your session. So you were able to find the session, that's step one. Everyone's getting in here. So a reminder about your agenda. If for some reason you get disconnected, you'll again be able to find this session and all of your sessions for today under your My Agenda button. When we also think about navigating this session page, hopefully you're able to see the chat. There's also a tab there for polls, people, and then files. So we've already preloaded several files for this session, as well as external links that will take you to some additional resource pages. So know anytime we reference a template, a document, an example, it's either posted in the files or a link to a website that has that available for download should be there for you as well. Specific to chats, polls, and Q&A, I see lots of chats coming in with where you are, so we know that you're able to engage in that chat. Please feel free to use that and have conversations as we go through. Under polls, there's a Q&A section, and there's a place where you can submit questions, and this is going to be really critical because we're going to make sure and save a chunk of time at the end of our session for two of our district exemplars. We want them to be able to answer questions from their district perspective. So if you've got a question, hop under polls. There's already a pre-populated place there for you to put in your questions. It says, what questions do you have for the presenters? You can also click over there, and if you see a question and you're like, yes, I want to hear that discussion, make sure you upvote it. Dr. Tim Lewis is our content facilitator, so he's going to monitor that Q&A and that chat and prompt us if there's a question that's in there, and particularly if one's getting a lot of upvotes. So that'll be key. Be careful about accidentally navigating away from the session. If you click on any of those other buttons, it's going to pop you out of the session. Again, you can always get back to us under your My Agenda section. If you have tech difficulties while you're in the session, you're welcome to use the Help Desk button, and we have tech support in our session as well. So please feel free to use that Help Desk button if you're having some difficulties. You are here for the Tier 2 strand, and so as you work with your team and as you listen to the content today, as we do with all of the sessions, consider these questions. How do what we talk about today about Tier 2 compare to the priorities that you have within your building or district, and who would oversee the work, or who already does if you're just making revisions? Considering what you should stop doing to make room for any additional things that you hear today that you want to consider developing or moving forward with implementation, and how will you know if it's working? And we're going to talk through some of that progress monitoring piece today as well. You are in the first session of the Tier 2 Systems and Practices strand. So I want to give you a quick overview. Today in this session, we're going to talk Tier 2 overview, what are some Tier 2 systems that are critical to have in place, and we're going to talk about some district level exemplars. The next 2 sessions are really going to hone in on specific tier 2 interventions. So in this first session, we're going to talk more about identification, data, selecting interventions, but the next 2 sessions are really going to give you more concrete information on what some of those tier 2 interventions look like. So hopefully if you complete all 3 sessions, you'll have a broader scope of tier 2. Now that we've done all of the organization, you're feeling acquainted to your technology, we want to kick off our session for today. So my name is Danielle Starkey. I am currently the MTSSB, or Multi-Tiered Systems of Support for Behavior Supervisor for Omaha Public Schools. Previously, I worked at the MU Center for School-Wide Positive Behavior Support and Missouri School-Wide Behavior Support for 11 years. This is my first year here in Omaha Public Schools. We currently have close to 100 schools and programs that are implementing at tier 1 and tier 2, and then a smaller number that are moving up the continuum to tier 3. So I'm coming to you as a former trainer, technical assistance provider at the state level and now at a district level. And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to give you a quick introduction about who she is.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Nantis. I am the Professional Learning Administrator for Michigan's Multi-Tiered System of Supports Technical Assistance Center. I'm excited to be here today. I am a school psychologist by training, and I worked for many years in the greater Cincinnati area, as well as in Kalamazoo area in Michigan, as a school psychologist and a coach for our MTSS implementation efforts in our districts. And for the last 11 years, I have been with the My MTSS TA Center, and I've had the opportunity to help support professional learning and technical assistance for our integrated reading and behavior MTSS framework. And I'm going to kick it over to Julie to do an introduction of herself.
Hi, I'm Julie Miller. I currently work as an elementary principal for Fremont Public Schools in Nebraska. I also have the opportunity to serve as our district MTSS team coordinator. And before I took this role, I had the opportunity to work for 5 years as a PBIS coach through the School Climate Transformation Grant, where we were able to work really closely with the TA Center out of the University of Missouri. So had a lot of great opportunities to work on this at the district level. And I will turn it over then to Chris.
Hi, good morning. Chris Hubig, Assistant Superintendent in Fulton Public Schools here in Missouri. This is my second year in this role as Assistant Superintendent. And much like Julie, I also serve as our facilitator for our district leadership team for PBIS. This is my 15th year in school administration, and during that time, I've worked closely with teachers and students on PBIS initiatives. So super excited to be with everyone today.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited about our team that we have together for our session. Speaking of our session, we're going to move into just what our outcomes are for this session. As Danielle said, this is the beginning of the 3 sessions around tier 2. So in this session, we're going to talk about the rationale for having tier 2 implementation, talk about the considerations for developing tier 2 supports within that continuum of PBIS, and really think about and understand the supports necessary to ensure effective district-wide tier 2 implementation. And we are really excited and honored to have both Chris and Julie here to share their perspectives and experiences as throughout our session, as well as opportunity at the end to have some question and answers. So without further ado, we're gonna dig in. The National Center has put together a really nice document called What is Tier 2 Supports? And that is one of the files that is available to you within this session. But the description or definition of tier 2 really focuses on this idea of providing supports for students and building your system to support those students who need something more than what is currently available for supports in tier 1, but not something as intensive and individualized as the supports provided at tier 3. So we talk about this as not quite as intense as tier 3, but more than tier 1. So being really intentional about building that continuum of supports. When we look at what are those critical features of tier 2, we're talking about targeted small group interventions, we're taking what we have happening for tier 1 implementation and being more precise, more intentional, providing more frequent supports, more frequent data collection, just really working to extend what we have going on in tier 1 in a very intentional way to help better support students for whom what we have going at tier 1 is not quite enough for them. When we have a really strong tier 2 system going, we have a way for identifying students who are in need of supports and matching them to supports and getting that support in a very quick manner. And one way of doing that is having those standardized interventions so that we're being very deliberate about the selection of our interventions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the big picture goal is really focused on how do we prevent or decrease problem behaviors from happening. And one of the things we've done in Michigan that we like to use a phrase of really building an efficient, effective, and equitable system that is designed to meet the needs of the students and best support them for success. So in order to do that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who's going to talk about getting us ready.
Yeah, so one of the first questions we should think about when we consider implementing tier 2 is, are we ready? So again, one of the files is a link to the National Center Tier 2 Readiness document that kind of outlines some questions for you building or district to consider as you move forward. The critical piece here is that data is going to indicate when we're ready to move forward and begin tier 2 implementation. And so we'll talk through briefly what are some of those data pieces, and then Julie's going to give us a concrete example in just a few minutes. So the first thing we want to think about is that knowing that tier 2 is an extension of tier 1, and when we get to tier 2, what you'll see throughout the session is we're really taking tier 1 practices and we're intensifying them for students that need additional supports. And so we have to check and see, are we implementing tier 1 with fidelity? Do teachers have the skills necessary to implement the base practices? If we're going to ask them later to implement them with more intensity and more frequency for some students, we have to know that we are able to implement some of these practices school-wide and at the classroom level. So the first is, that idea of, are we implementing tier 1 with fidelity? And you'll see on the readiness document, that super small text here, but again, you can download it in the files, looking at some data pieces such as your tiered fidelity inventory tier 1 score, or your school-wide evaluation tool, the benchmarks of quality. There are a ton of tools. Primarily, we use the tiered fidelity inventory now on PBIS apps. That really helps you get a quick gauge on, do we have the essential pieces of tier 1 in place? We can also look at the SAS, or the self-assessment score, the self-assessment survey that all staff take to also look at kind of, are we implementing tier 1 with fidelity? Another data piece to consider is looking at your office referrals or your behavior events within your building and district. There's often guidance for, are there about 80% of students that are responding to your tier 1 implementation efforts? So do 80% of students have 0 or 1 office referral? That's really making sure, again, that we have that foundational prevention piece in place. We don't want to start tier 2 too soon and have a significant number of students get identified as needing tier 2 and or tier 3 supports when we're not going to be able to systematically support that. So first question, are we implementing tier 1 with fidelity? I'd love if you can drop in chat what data sources you currently use to kind of monitor tier 1 implementation. The second thing to consider is, are we consistently using our school-wide data at tier 1 for decision making? So are we pulling that big 5 data? Are we looking at school-wide data on who, what, where, when, why our behavior is happening, and responding at a school-wide or district-wide approach? Really being able to use that data and intervening, again, is going to help prevent problems from happening and decrease the number of students that need additional supports. I love your chats that I see popping in about your data sources that you're using. Other things to think about is the school principal committed to tier 2? Is there a plan to inform staff about how we're moving forward and what that looks like, and our staff in support of doing that? Also thinking about, are we beginning to conceptualize how we'll align supports? Many buildings are already doing things related to tier 2 and tier 3 behavior supports. So how do we align that? And then thinking about, do you have a small group of people that could be identified as that tier 2 team to really begin to develop the systems that we'll talk about in a few minutes? And has your district committed to supporting your implementation? We know that's hard for schools to be able to implement school-wide systems at tier 2 and tier 3 on their own. So is there some district level support to move that forward? So I'm going to turn it over to Julie. That's going to talk a little bit about what tier 2 readiness looks like in action.
Thanks, Danielle. So I just included a couple examples of things that we worked through in Fremont. And the first one here is just kind of a snapshot of all of the tier 1 only data that we look at on a regular ongoing basis. So I included it this way so you can see that we did not start all of these in our first few years of implementation, but over 5 years, started with some of the measures that Danielle talked about and added them as we went through. So these are data sources that we're looking at yearly for some of them are more frequently where we're reviewing them, like our student data every month, that's Swiss data. And if you pop to the next slide, this is actually our tier 1 criteria that needs to be met before a school can move to tier 2. So the items that are on there, I know it's very small, but are similar to the things that Danielle talked about in the readiness guide that's available from Missouri. And we have this for tier 1 and for tier 2 because we have schools that are moving into tier 3. So when schools get together and review their yearly data and are talking about moving to that next level, they go through this, look at the different data points and kind of come to consensus on if they've met it or not. One thing that we've added, if they have not met the criteria, they have to add their action steps in the document for the district team of what they're planning on doing to meet it. So if a school maybe on the TFI got a 79% in one of the areas, or 69%, excuse me, wouldn't necessarily mean that they weren't able to start some of the tier 2 stuff, but we would need to know that they had a plan in place to address it. So then we review that information at the district level, both compiled through each indicator, but also at each building so that we're able to offer support. And on the next slide, it just shows that we do have a standardized system for then how we provide support to schools. So if they haven't met one of the readiness criteria, what kind of support are we as a district going to provide to them to help get them ready? Because moving through the process isn't an option. So we need to make sure that we have a way to provide them support to get them where they need to be. So that's our readiness criteria.
Thanks, Julie. Sorry about the slides jumping. I really appreciate that, and having that clear thought process that you, both you and Danielle shared about having a readiness and really intentionality of that, and from that district perspective, that's really helpful. So one of the tier 2 readiness things that Danielle mentioned was identification of a team that's going to help support the implementation efforts at tier 2. So if you look at this slide, you'll see information directly pulled from the tiered fidelity inventory, the tier 2 item around the team. And so thinking really systematically, who makes up who's on that team. And so think about it from a function perspective, someone who's going to help coordinate the implementation efforts, someone who's got that applied behavioral expertise, whether it's behavior specialist, school psychologist, social worker, whoever it might be, that brings that behavioral expertise to the table. Equally important is that academic expertise. Many of us have seen that kind of tongue-in-cheek joke, which came first, the chicken or the egg, the academic difficulties or the behavioral difficulties. We often see those things happening together. And so being really intentional about that, having both sets of expertise at the table, an administrator at the table helping to make decisions, helping to support the decisions that are being made by teams, the classroom teacher and a coach. Depending on the size of your district, this could be a team in addition to your tier 1 team with very intentional overlap and a strong communication between the 2 teams. If you're a smaller school, it may end up being the same team that's leading your tier 1 implementation efforts. And then in that case, there's always a very intentional conversation about when are we talking about tier 1 supports, when are we talking about our tier 2 supports, and how do we make sure that those are continued to be strengthened. Sometimes, as Danielle mentioned, if you're not being mindful of what's happening at tier 1, and tier 2 is supposed to be an extension of and intensification of what's happening at tier 1. You need to make sure that you have that connection happening between the two. You can't intensify something that's not being implemented well at tier 1 or just doesn't exist. So those connections are going to be really helpful as you're moving this work forward, but thinking really intentionally about who's on that team and how you structure that given the context of your own school. Once that team is formed, there's some responsibilities and some thoughtfulness that goes into this. So meeting on a regular basis, this team is going to identify which tier 2 interventions are available to help support students. And I know in Michigan, oftentimes this team is also identifying where the gaps are and maybe communicating those up to our district team as a barrier, saying, hey, we have identified needs, but we don't necessarily have the interventions that we need at this time to match those needs. What can we do as a district to help address that barrier? They're going to be reviewing students identified for additional supports and working to make sure that the system's set up to match students to the intervention supports that they need. Remember, keeping that effective, efficient, equitable mindset as they're engaged in this work. And there's a level of support for interventions, training for families, school, staff, and students, so that we're really intentional about making sure that as we're matching students to interventions, as students are accessing interventions, that we have support for those we're asking to implement and support the interventions that are happening. So there's a real intentionality about that. A lot of what we know about just really good meaning mechanics and supports need to be in place for this to run, keeping that efficient, effective, and equitable mindset in place. So things like you see on the screen, again, tiny, but are available in the resources under the files tab. Having good, strong things like meeting agenda, minutes, and a problem-solving action plan focus to help really hone in on what is the focus of your conversations, what are your intended outcomes for your meeting, what are the action items coming out, what data are you going to review to help inform your decisions, being really intentional that you're looking at that data pretty quickly when you're meeting as a team, because that's going to help drive the conversations. In Michigan, we've created some packets around team operating procedures. So one of the first things that we're asking teams to do is define how they're going to operate together so that they're able to be that efficient teaming structure, that they're able to make sure that they have access to the data they need to drive those decisions. And having just a template that works well for your team is going to really help with those efficiencies. So these are a couple of those examples. There are more out there, but it helps to really drive what you're going to be doing.
And I want to say that many of those examples that you're going to see on that slide, this slide, and previous ones, in the files, there's a link to the Missouri School-Wide PBIS Tier 2 workbook and resources page. And if you go to that page, they're going to have everything related to tier 2, and many of these are available as Word documents or PDF examples. So we didn't necessarily always link every single document within the files here, but if you go to that Missouri tier 2 webpage, you'll find all of the available downloads. So when we think about tier 2, you've got your team established, you've met readiness, you've got your team established, and now we really have to think about how do we begin to develop this tier 2 process and these systems that we need. The goal is going to be that we have a systematic identification process, a bank of research-based interventions, and clear procedures for progress monitoring students within those interventions, and then our system overall. And so the first step is to make sure that we have a really comprehensive, robust student identification plan for how are we going to systematically identify students in a way that promotes early identification so that we're catching students when they're truly at risk before the behavior problems are becoming persistent and in need of tier 3 supports. So we want to have an identification plan that's clearly defined and documented, where all students can be considered. Again, we're thinking about that early identification. And another critical piece is we really want to make sure that our identification systems are thinking about identifying students that have both internalizing and externalizing concerns. And so we'll think about students who might have internalizing behaviors, shy, withdrawn, anxious, worried, they don't engage with their peers, they seem sad, depressed. not attending school, versus some of those more externalizing behaviors. I'm talking out, I'm blurting, I'm a little non-compliant, disrespectful. Those behaviors are things that are external and are the ones we're more likely to identify for needing tier 2 supports. But it's important to consider students that have those internalizing behaviors as well. So when we think about identification, we typically talk about 3 methods for identifying students that need tier 2 supports. If you already have some of these in place, I'd love to hear more about it in chat. So feel free to document what you're already doing there. I think there's also a poll that talks about what data decision rules might you have for tier 2. So feel free to pop over to there and do that as well. But the 3 methods we talk about are 1, nomination. Do we have a simple, short, easy to complete way for teachers, parents, even students to nominate themselves and say, hey, I think this student might need some additional supports. The form is meant to help identify students, not hinder the process. And I say that because sometimes when we think about nomination forms, they get robust and complicated and ask teachers to go back and pull a bunch of data. And sometimes the thought of having to do that will decrease the likelihood that a teacher completes it. So we want a nomination form that collects enough information for us to make an informed decision, but is easy and quick so that it promotes teachers to use it. Some buildings will actually, we have a couple here in Omaha Public Schools where at a staff meeting, they even give teachers time to consider their class list and think about if there's a student that displays the behaviors listed on the nomination, and teachers can just fill out the nomination right there. It's giving them some set aside time to do that. Another process is having some defined data decision rules. So this is looking at what data do you already collect in your building or district. We collect a lot of data, academic, behavioral, on students. And so let's use that already existing data and set some cut points for when might a student be at risk. So on the Missouri School-wide PBIS website that I know Tim popped in chat, under student identification, there's a template for this. And it really gets you thinking about what data do we already collect? Office referrals, classroom minors, attendance, grades, nurse visits, counselor visits. And what would be a proficient score? What would a typically developing student that we don't have any concerns about, what would their data look like? And then what would be at risk? So for example, office referrals. Maybe when a student hits the second one, we would consider that at risk. And then we can also have a high risk column so that we had some tier 3 identification pieces when we got there. It also asks you to consider the person responsible and how often we're going to review the data. The easier part is looking at the measures and figuring out what's going to be an at-risk indicator. The trickier part is then consistently checking that data and collecting the names of students that meet that criteria to bring it back to your team. A third method is universal screening. So there are a number of social, emotional, behavioral universal screening instruments out there that allow teachers or even the students themselves to answer a set of questions about social, emotional, behavioral related items. And those systems often have scoring procedures and in many cases systems, sometimes they cost funds, but that will flag a student that may be at risk in a social, emotional, or behavioral category. And so that's a way to quickly look at all students and identify a number of students at one time to place an intervention. In order to have what we would consider a robust identification system, it would be recommended that schools had at least 2 of these methods so that we have multiple ways to identify students that might need additional supports. Again, all 3 of these example templates are available on that PBISmissouri.org under Tier 2 student identification. So you can log in there, download them, and fit them to your building. Chris is going to talk to us a little bit about how Fulton Public Schools set up a district-wide Tier 2 student identification process.
All right, the chart that's been provided on this particular slide was developed by our district leadership team last year. We realized quickly that collaboration during COVID was not going to look the same way. We had developed some pretty intensive tier 1 systems to ensure fidelity. So we put that on the shelf for last school year and really doubled down on evaluating our practices and developing some coherence there. So This chart illustrates our collective practices going all the way from pre-K up through high school. The student identification process for Tier 2 supports truly begins with a fidelity check of Tier 1. Did we provide everything that we said that we would? So those universal expectations or procedures in the classroom and across the building. Did students receive any feedback or recognition for following those universal expectations? And of course, we would assume on this flow chart, if the answer is yes, then those 3 identification methods that Danielle just shared, we would go through those. So talk a little bit about each one here, at least in Fulton Public Schools. Each school has a nomination form to request assistance. Now this runs through a student success team meeting format, which explores current academic performance, social emotional challenges, behavioral challenges. The nomination form also considers other supports the student may receive, such as special education services, speech and language, 504 accommodations. Problem behaviors are reported specifically as either internalizing or externalizing activities. And then, of course, we consider the location, the time of day. We review those. A checklist of Tier 1 interventions is also completed, just to ensure not only did we just want to make sure that we've gone through some of those easy to accomplish interventions before we complete this. In terms of school data, we do look at what we already have that's already been produced. So each unique grade span from pre-K up through high school has developed a data decision rule as an early warning sign that might tell us we need to study further or provide immediate support. So typically it's about 3 office discipline referrals. This would meet the criteria at each school for consideration. Pre-K through elementary, they use Swiss as far as the reporting. Middle school uses Behavior Flip, and high school uses Pulse reports from SIS K-12. In terms of universal screening, there's other screening information that focuses on academic performance. iReady is something we use at the elementary level, K through 5, for math and reading. DIBELS would be another source, and then NWEA at the middle school level. We also collect some social emotional data. We were using, I saw in the chat, many schools are using SABRES. We used that for probably 2 years. Last year, unexpectedly, we ran into some issues with the syncing, the back end with our system. So we set out to find a free mental health screener. So we use the SRSS, the Student Risk Screening Scale, in grades K through 12. Data is used by social workers, counselors, and principals to develop small groups for further interventions. In grades 5 through 12, students complete a mental health screener that has elements from 2 different inventories. So we use the PHQ-9, which screens for depressive symptoms, and the GAD-7, which screens for anxiety. At the Early Childhood Center, we use the DECA screener, the Devereaux Early Childhood Assessment, as a social emotional wellness screener. And this helps the staff strengthen the students' protective factors. As far as the team and the teacher and the team, or the success team, they use the functional assessment checklist for teachers and staff, or the FACTS, to clarify problem behavior. So this is kind of our SMART goal here. Clarify it in observable, measurable terms, collecting any data, completing a context analysis of social or behavioral performance of the student. At that point, the next part includes efforts to determine the function of the behavior, whether or not it's to gain something or to avoid something. And then, as you see below on the chart, an appropriate intervention is selected. So I did want to note there's one column there where check and connect ordinarily would have been, and we considered that, and our staff has had some training in check and connect. But for probably about 2 years, we have implemented the JAG program, which is the Jobs for America's Graduates. We saw a lot of similarity between the program goals and the interactivity between a coach or a mentor in Check and Connect, and then the instructor with the JAG program. So that is in place both at the middle school and the high school in our district. And so in essence, that's our process, pre-K-12.
Thanks for sharing, Chris. And I saw several comments coming through chat on this. So again, kudos to you and Fulton Public Schools for putting together such a great comprehensive plan. I did want to note and give some positive specific feedback to all of you as attendees for completing the poll. So we had a poll question about, has your school or district already established data decision rules related to identifying students in need of Tier 2 intervention? And a majority, 72% of you said yes. So again, you've already got some things happening. We'd love to hear about them in chat as we go through. And if you haven't, these might be, again, some additional resources, templates to get you started on that. So Chris jumped in a little bit too and started talking about, once we've identified, how do we determine function and select intervention? So Melissa is going to expand a little bit more on that.
Thanks, Danielle and Chris. So we're gonna, talk a little bit about that idea of how do we select interventions and match them to students. So again, keeping that idea of efficient, effective, and equitable, we want to make sure that we're thinking about which interventions are best matched to what we know about the student. So why are the students engaging in certain behavior, and how do we select an intervention that's matched to that function in order to increase the likelihood that the intervention is going to be successful. So for some people who don't have a strong behavioral background, sometimes that's hard to think about that. And so sometimes we use the analogy of like an academic approach. If I know a student is struggling to decode words, giving them an intervention that's going to build their fluency in reading is probably not going to be the best match because they're missing a specific skill. When we flip it over to the behavior side, we want to think about what function is the current behavior serving for that student. And if we know it's like the function of the behavior is related to, say, getting pure adult attention, putting an intervention in place that doesn't try to maximize their access to pure adult attention in a way that meets school defined expected behaviors probably is not going to be the most successful. So part of it is really thinking about how do you select function-based interventions, the right match to what the students are telling, communicating with their behavior, but also helping staff and families think about function to the point where a few years back, I had a couple colleagues who very kindly for me rewrote the words for the old Schoolhouse Rock song, conjunction, junction, what's your function, to behavior, behavior, what's your function, as a way to really intentionally start to get people thinking about function of behavior so that when we're making these selections, we're increasing the likelihood that we're matching what the student's needs are to the intent of the intervention. So here's one example of how a school can organize, similar to what Chris had in his example, just a little bit more of a close-up. You'll see on the left-hand side, we see common functions of behavior: getting adult attention, peer attention, avoiding adult attention or peer attention, avoiding tasks or access to activities or tangibles. And then across the top, you see all the different behavioral interventions available in this school setting, and just an intentional crosswalk of what function does each intervention address, so that when we're making that selection, when we're narrowing in on what our kind of like precise problem statement is, or what we're focusing on for that student, that we're making the right selection for intervention, so that there's always that intentionality in that matching. So again, just another way schools have approached this. So similar to what we saw in Danielle and Chris's examples, we've got that data across the top, the nomination, our existing school data, our universal screening, and all those are coming together and looking at that data with the teacher and the team. And part of that conversation is really thinking about what is maintaining the problem behaviors, what data do we have that is communicating about what's happening with these students. And then once we've determined the function of the behavior, we're really making a selection about which interventions are most likely to help set the student and the staff and families up for success by matching to that function. So really being really intentional and understanding what's available within your system, and thinking really intentionally about what function are, what are the perceived function of the behaviors we're seeing, and what are we going to do to match the best intervention that's most likely to set that student up for success. Another way that we've approached that in Michigan, one of the things we realized was oftentimes staff aren't aware of all the interventions that are available, or if they've never had a student say in an intervention like check in, check out, or check and connect, or first step, they don't know what it is. So we've started building out, our leadership teams have started building out intervention platform, these kind of like a grid based off of some of the work we saw Dr. Kathleen Lane do, where we really intentionally identify what is that intervention support. So describing what it is, and in that description, thinking about critical skills that are being taught or the function of behavior addressed by that intervention, so that we can be really intentional in making sure all staff, students, families are aware of what's available, especially if you're thinking about your data sources, and one source might be nomination, but knowing what's available and what function each of those interventions addresses, again, sets ourselves up for success and helps us to really hone in on being efficient, effective, and equitable by using a match to what we know is the function of those behaviors, and really intentionality in selection. So we have another poll, and we were just curious how many of you, and some of you have already started responding to that one. Does your school or district have a defined system process to ensure that tier 2 interventions practices are being matched to the identified needs of our students? And it looks like we are pretty close neck and neck race going on here. A little over 40% are saying, yes, you have that. And a little closer to 45% are saying that, that's no, not in place yet. So when we start thinking about how do you build a really strong tier 2 system, having your tier 2 support team thinking about and doing that inventory of what are those interventions that are available, and that crosswalk of looking at what functions do each of those interventions address. A nice starting place is going back to the tiered fidelity inventory, and I believe it's Appendix B that starts to look at targeted intervention resource guide, mapping that, and gives you a table to start with, where it has really some optional potential intervention options, where you can start to make that intentionality similar to what we see here in considering function, or back to Chris's example of what do these different interventions functions do we address in terms of behavior, and matching students to those. So once we have that data and making that really intentional connection to what is the function that we're seeing of the behavior, and how do our interventions intentionally match those. And then we're going to turn it over to Danielle.
Thanks. So we've talked through, establishing readiness, having a strong team, setting up solid identification processes, beginning to think about how can we quickly within our tier 2 team kind of gauge function to make sure that we're selecting an appropriate tier 2 intervention or practice. Again, when we're doing function at tier 2, it's not going to be quite as comprehensive as tier 3, as we've talked about, but just gauging some quick informal data collections that we already have in place, looking at a brief facts, I see that coming up in chat, and just being able to make some educated, informed decisions about function. Then we get to the tier 2 practices or interventions piece. Again, the goal would be that your school and or district had a bank of readily available interventions, so that when student gets identified, we discuss function, we can then look at our chart and think about, okay, which intervention do we have readily available that students can access? We know that takes time. That's not a quick process to build multiple interventions, but definitely gives you that robust tier 2 process. We're not going to spend very many minutes in this session talking about practices or interventions, because that's really what the next 2 sessions in the Strand are. What we wanted to focus on here is just overall big picture, what are tier 2 interventions when we talk about them? So we want tier 2 interventions within your system to be continuously available. Student gets identified, we talk about them at our tier 2 meeting, we decide this intervention would be applicable. We want to be able to give them continuous access, and ideally within 72 hours of that nomination, meeting that rule or having that discussion as a team. Again, we want the interventions to have low effort by teachers, but the effort and the time we're asking them to put into the interventions is critical. There's often, I think, a misconception that at tier 2, students are going to go somewhere and something magical is going to happen, and they're going to engage in appropriate behavior when they come back to the classroom. And we know that's just not the case. Those tier 2 interventions are going to have critical components for teachers to prompt use of skills, to remind students of skills, and to give really structured feedback about the use of your expectations. So we want them to be aligned back with your school-wide expectations and to be function-based. Again, ideally, students are willing participants in the interventions. As you learn more about the interventions, you'll know, again, why that's so critical. But if a student isn't willing to participate in your intervention components, it's not likely to be effective. And so as we think about those tier 2 interventions, another component is that we're collecting data. They're continuously monitored. And so we'll talk about that again, or we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But really, when we think about tier 2, we're getting some structured interventions, check in, check out, social skills instructional groups, academic interventions, check and connect, whatever it might be. And when you think about those interventions and the components, they're really intensifying tier 1 and implementing it in a more structured format for some students. And so again, the next 2 sessions will focus in on specifics here. But I want you thinking about, as Melissa clicks to the next slide, about your interventions that you have available and what functions those serve, or what interventions you want to build across your district. Here in Omaha Public Schools, we systematically train our schools on check in, check out, social skills intervention groups, and self-monitoring right now. So within district, we have the capacity to provide training, support, and progress monitoring on those interventions. So just thinking about what interventions would be applicable to your school or district and how do we build capacity. And then the next 2 sessions will help you learn those specifics. But no matter what interventions you have in place, making sure we have a good systematic process for progress monitoring is going to be key. And Melissa is going to talk about that now.
Thanks, Danielle. So we've talked about like that team and their what they exist to do, about how we go about identifying students, how we match interventions to functions, how we are really intentional about that, and then think about the role of that team as we in that continuous improvement process and cycle. And so one of the things we do is talk about progress monitoring. So how do we have the data we need to engage in that data-based decision-making portion of a multi-tiered behavioral framework? So we really want to think about a couple sets of data: our student progress monitoring data, as well as our fidelity of implementation data. Our fidelity data is going to help us answer those questions of, did we do what we said we were going to do? And our student progress monitoring data is going to help answer the question, and is it working? And so oftentimes when we think about fidelity, we're thinking about like the big picture system TFI, but we're also going to talk about fidelity as it relates to the specific interventions that we have in place. So here we just have a couple examples for those of you who are familiar with check-in, check-outs as an intervention, a tier 2 intervention or a behavior education program. These are data slides from check-in, check-out Swiss, which makes having that data that is collected from the intervention easily displayed as a visual to help make decisions. Now you'll see the word confidential on these slides. These are still fake data sets that we put together to display some data patterns that you might see as you start thinking about whether or not the intervention that you're implementing, is it having the intended effect? So having progress monitoring graphs, having those visual displays of data makes the job of the team looking at and thinking, are students making adequate progress in these interventions? Are we seeing the outcomes that we would hope to? Do we need to maintain an intervention? Do we need to alter it or fade the supports because the students have met their goals? Really a helpful way of doing it. So having a data visual is helpful. Here's another example. It's from Port Huron Area School District in Michigan. This was a targeted behavioral intervention they had focusing on attendance. And in this case, they had created a spreadsheet with looking at the average days absent for each student in their group. And they were monitoring that as their data source, and then looking across the effectiveness of that intervention as a group of students participating, as well as for individual students. So for some students, they were seeing success. For other students, they were not seeing as much success. And so they needed to make some decisions about how to intensify the supports, and then some contextual variables For example, having a student who was out for medical issues or for funerals, things like that, contributing to some of the variables that were at play as they were making decisions around their interventions. And one of the things that helps to create that efficient and effective and equitable system is once you have students who are in interventions and you're collecting progress monitoring data, is to have some decision rules that are really designed to inform what decisions you're going to make based on your data in order to determine, do we maintain, alter, or fade? So we start to move away from that I think, I feel, to building our decisions, really grounding them in data that we have on the students' performance that will help us make those decisions along the way. And if we have those decision rules defined ahead of time, it's going to help us with our efficiency in our meetings. So we have a set of example check-in, check-out decision rules. I believe we built these off of the examples from Missouri, but one of our schools took this and really said, okay, for check-in, check-out, when would we say we're ready to fade an intervention for a student? What would the data pattern look like that would say, hey, we need to alter what's going on for the students? We're not ready to walk away from this intervention, but we want to change something up in order to continue to see progress or to strengthen the outcomes we're seeing. Or is the data on a trajectory or path that tells us we can maintain what we're doing right now because the student's making progress and we need to revisit where we're heading? And again, having those decision rules ahead of time is helpful. So if you wouldn't mind, just go ahead and pop it in the chat. Do you have a set of decision rules that you use for your tier 2 interventions that help to make those decisions for your team efficient and effective? And so I see some people coming in yes, and some people saying no. So if you have that, that is awesome. It's cool. And one of the things we've learned is schools who have them, it is very helpful practice to, on an at least annual basis, to revisit them and see if those are still working the way you intended them to, or perhaps do they need adjustments. And then for those of you who don't, that might be a really nice place to start off, is to have those decision rules defined.
Melissa, and I don't think we linked it directly in the files, but I want to make sure and give a quick shout out. I even think I saw a chat by Gordon Way in our chat of our session, but Gordon Way is the data and web consultant for Missouri Schoolwide PBIS, and he's created an amazing advanced tier spreadsheet. It's an Excel spreadsheet that's free. When you're on that PBIS Missouri site under tier 2, there's a tier 2 data tools, and there's an Excel spreadsheet with directions, and you can download it. And it's a really great way to progress monitor and get graphs for interventions such as check-in, check-out, and it's free and it's already developed for you. You just have to enter your data. So shout out to Gordon. And if you need a tool to be able to track data, go download it.
Thanks, Danielle. And some of our favorite words, already built and free. So that's awesome to have that. And so I see some people who have those decision rules and some folks who don't. I do know having the visual displays. So if you've got your decision rules out in front of you and you have your visual display, sometimes that is much more efficient to make those decisions along the way. The other part that we talked about when we talked about progress monitoring is that fidelity of implementation. So what you see, it's tiny on the screen, but we can upload it into the files if it's not already there, is having a fidelity checklist for each intervention that you're doing. So it's going to help you answer the question, did we do what we said we were going to do? So this is an example relative to check-in, check-out. So just taking those critical components of what makes check-in, check-out a very intentional, evidence-based tier 2 intervention, and really going through, did we do what we're going to say we're going to do? The power behind the intervention includes things like having the morning check-in and the afternoon check-out. If you're not doing those pieces and you're not seeing strong outcomes for student, we might not want to throw the intervention out, but rather really shore up our implementation efforts. So pairing your student progress monitoring data with your fidelity of implementation data, whether or not you're actually implementing each intervention as intended, will help you make those decisions with more confidence as to whether or not you need to maintain, alter, fade an intervention. If you're not sure if the intervention is actually happening, if you don't have evidence that supports that, it's really hard to say you're making decisions with any degree of confidence because it may not be, what you're seeing may or may not be related to the intervention itself. But if we can say with confidence, hey, we know check in, check out as an example of a tier 2 intervention, or the social skills groups or whatever it might be are happening the way we intended, and Melissa's still struggling, we're not seeing the outcomes we would expect, we need to think about whether or not we need to intensify our supports for that intervention, or maybe try something else. But if we don't have that data, it's really hard to say whether or not the intervention's working, because we don't have necessarily the confidence to say that it was implemented as intended. So when we think about that, we've got our student progress monitoring, we've got our intervention fidelity data, but we also have this other layer when it comes to our data collection, which is overall our big picture look at our program evaluation. And the TFI talks about this in that idea of, are the students who are in need of tier 2 supports accessing those tier 2 supports? And of those who are accessing it, how successful are they? So here's one example that we've used in Michigan. On a regular basis, our tier 2 behavior support teams are looking at access and then effectiveness. So how many students, based on their decision rules, like for example, a number of students with 2 or more discipline referrals in the month of October. So let's say we have 7. Of those students, how many students are actually, of those 7 students, how many of them are actually receiving behavioral intervention? And then we can calculate a percentage. So if we have 8 students who need it and 8 students who are receiving it, 100% of our students are accessing behavioral interventions. But if we have 8 students who meet the criteria for an intervention, but only 4 are actually accessing that support, our system's only currently supporting 50% of the students who have been identified as needing more support. And so our problem solving needs to be up big picture at the system level. What's preventing us from getting students matched to the intervention and getting access to interventions in a timely fashion, so that by the time we come back in November and look at that data again, or in December, we hopefully see an improvement. So Danielle's going to walk us through another example.
Yeah, so this is just another big picture program evaluation, thinking about the interventions that you've selected. When you've got them up and going, how do we know it's worth the time, energy, and resources that we're putting into them? So this is a quick table that you could put together. You can also steal it from PBISmissouri.org. You list your interventions on the left side. Think about the number of students who have participated in that intervention this year. How many students have graduated from the intervention? So they participated, it was successful, they no longer need tier 2 supports. And what is the number of students that participated but needed more? The intervention was not successful for them. And this gives you a big picture of, okay, how many students are we serving in our interventions, and is it being successful? Are we able to successfully fade students from the intervention? If we looked at this and we had 90 students in check-in, check-out, and only 30 of them graduated and 40 needed additional supports, that's where we need to go back to, are we implementing this intervention with fidelity? Why aren't students being successful? Versus if our data indicates we had a significant number participating and they were being successful, that tells us that that intervention is a really good place to invest time, energy, resources, and professional development on. So thinking big picture, we've got a team, we have systematic identification criteria in place, a bank of interventions, and then we're progress monitoring students and our overall tier 2 system to see if it's being effective in our school. What we want to do now is, quite frankly, the best part of the session, and that is hear a little bit more from Chris and Julie in response to some of your questions. And I think Dr. Lewis said there were a couple, and so he's going to pop over and pose a couple of questions, I believe, to Julie and or Chris. And then Melissa and I have a couple questions as well if we run out of participant questions, but I think you have some great ones. So Dr. Lewis.
Yep, lots of good questions coming in, both through polls and chat. We'll start with the first. There were several questions just about kind of the teaming structure and process. So what does a typical tier 2 team meeting agenda look like? And then several folks were asking about, do you meld academic and social emotional behavior or have independent? So Julie, maybe we'll start with you. You're from a smaller district. Maybe talk a little bit about how you addressed academic and social emotional behavior and without overtaxing the school personnel.
Yeah, so we look at them separately and together. So When we started, we had academic teams that were working in the buildings when we started with the school climate transformation grant, but they were not very effective, and there was no real systemic way of looking at that. So we kind of pulled back when we redove into PBIS, and currently each of our building teams at tier 2 meets twice a month as a team, kind of stakeholders throughout the building. But then we also have an academic team, and there are a lot of the same people, a lot of the same core team members, but there are some that maybe sit on one team and not the other. And they meet the opposite 2 weeks to look at the academic data. But then we also meet with our grade level team that includes the classroom teachers once a month, where we kind of look at everything. And that meeting's a little bit longer. It's usually a little bit over an hour. And then we have ongoing communication in between those meetings. But that way, at least once a week, we're talking about students and the supports that we're getting, and have enough crossover members that if we feel like it's an academic issue that really is a behavior issue, or vice versa, we can look at kind of a more comprehensive support plan for them. I think our goal eventually is to kind of merge those together, but right now kind of the braiding of teams together is working well for us here.
Great. Chris, do you want to add?
Yeah, I would say our approach has been pretty similar in what Julie just described, that I think every school, it's a little bit different. A real focus this year has been attendance, in-person attendance, and that has been a challenge, and we're trying to apply the same problem solving, the tiered logic of problem solving. So I would say some of our, like the middle school, for example, uses a student success team model, where if students are in small groups or they're participating in check and connect or check and check out, there's going to be conversations about how students are doing and, considering fading where appropriate. But we're also, as a district, we'll be developing a more comprehensive MTSS framework that probably takes into account multi-tiers and multi-domains. So academic supports, college and career readiness, where you could also put in attendance as well, and then behavioral supports or social emotional. So I think right now it's a fairly representative team. We are fortunate to have a social worker for every level in our district. So social worker, counselor, administrator, and then for tier 2, we'll also have some PBIS team members from the building leadership team who serve on that committee as well.
Great. Chris, I'll follow up with you while you're on. Another question that came in, and we get this quite a bit. Danielle and Melissa really stressed that readiness factor, but it's sort of like, well, what if we're not ready, right? What if we don't have tier 1 at total fidelity implementation, but we've got kids who need those tier 2 supports? What advice or recommendation, or how have schools in Fulton kind of addressed that?
Well, I certainly understand that you can't really afford to wait when somebody needs a more intensive intervention, but I would also encourage folks, just like if the boat you're in is springing a leak, fix the leak. I feel like tier 1 is one area that would consistently undermine your ability for a tier 2 intervention to really support a student and see sustained improvement and growth. So I guess I don't know that it's necessarily, we've always been trained that tier 1 must be solid before you advance. And I still believe that, but I guess focus on doing the next best thing you can do for the student to support their wellness, their success in the setting. So I don't know that I would wait until some arbitrary, deadline is reached, or until your TFI says, okay, we're good with tier 1 now. Don't know if that's helpful or not, but it's concerned me that I think as a school system advances to higher levels of student support, we can't neglect the importance of tier 1. I think that's continuous work. You never arrive in this work. So I guess I would encourage schools to work on both at the same time.
Great. No, absolutely. It's the old acronym or the old metaphor about building the plane while we're flying it. Julie, your district is a good example of building the plane while you flew it. Anything to add about continuing to really emphasize and build those universals, but you got to respond to kids and their needs.
Yeah, we just continue to hit really hard that the best approach to tier 2 is to implement tier 1 with fidelity. And that by doing that, we're able, if we're able to do that really well, we see so many less students struggle that need that individualized support to begin with. But for those ones that are not responding, obviously, we have to do something. So here we kind of encouraged our buildings to keep doing what they were doing before, because of course they were doing something. We weren't just letting kids drown, as we're continuing to work on that tier 1, and then did pull some of those students in as we started to pilot. And honestly, I think that really helped us with the piloting of tier 2s and the more standardized intervention, because I think it allowed them to see how taxing it is to have that strong tier 1 in place and be working on that really hard, but still trying to do all of these individualized things for all of these kids. So we really pushed our schools to keep working on that tier 1. And then if they weren't completely there when we as a district were kind of ready to start training on tier 2, we set them up with people in the district that then help support them through those action steps at tier 1 to make sure that wasn't getting dropped as we started working on tier 2, that still was a big focus.
Great. And I would just add to that and encourage all of the folks tuning in today to look at the classroom supports. Classrooms often are a great bridge between tier 1 into tier 2. Julie, I was going to keep you guys are really turning your cameras off quick, man. You are quick on the switch today. Great question that came in terms of engaging families. And the question was along the lines of, well, what do you do if a family does show up to that tier 2 meeting and you've kind of gone through the process and you think this kid might be good for something like check in, check out, but the family's asking for something else? How would you respond to that family's request?
I think just talk to them and see, is there a specific reason that they want check in, check out? I think with that one in particular, it's probably because they want a DPR report coming home every day. And in Fremont, we have that for our social skills groups as well. So if we felt maybe that was more appropriate, I think really explaining to the family what it is that we're seeing, why we feel like this would be the best approach for their student. And then working with them through that. I think a lot of times they just don't understand the components, or there's one specific thing from an intervention they really want that we usually can incorporate or already have set up in the other interventions that we're doing.
Perfect. Chris, anything to add?
Not really. I do think it's important to listen to the family and try to educate the family on what the purpose of that intervention would be. Again, it goes back to tier 1. I think if somebody is asking specifically for check in, check out, I think maybe what we're really craving is just a more intense tier 1 connection. And so I would hate to deny access to something like that, but there's only so many DPRs I think our faculty are prepared to manage effectively.
Great. Yeah, no, my advice is always first reinforce. If families show up and they want to be engaged, that's a good sign. But yeah, I think having that conversation, and the other bit of advice I say, focus on the outcome. What's the outcome that family's after, and then sort of work backwards and talk about and problem solve how we get there. Great stuff, Chris and Julie. I'm going to throw this back to Danielle and Melissa, though, just given the size of your districts. At a district level, we haven't identified all the components, but how do we start? They indicate they've got 60 plus schools from pre-K to 12. Do you start with just a couple pilot schools? Do you start all at once? So what would be your recommendation given both of your collective experiences in helping larger school districts get underway?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And one of the things that Omaha Public Schools did before I officially joined is really used a readiness checklist, just like we talked about earlier, to be able to say, okay, you know, we have almost 100 schools and programs. How do we know when people are ready? And so there was a district-wide readiness criteria at the district level. Data was reviewed. And initially, it just happened to fall out to be a smaller subset of schools that were ready. And so schools were phased into tier 2 over multiple years as they met that readiness requirements. And really part of that was building an in-district system for what interventions do we want to be able to provide to schools? What is our district-wide, much like Chris had, district-wide identification process? And so if we're able to, I think at the district level first, think about what are the data we're collecting? How will we determine readiness? And then what will our district rollout of tier 2 look like? And we can plan some of that first. Then we're able to start phasing schools in as they meet readiness criteria. And if you haven't done it before, again, maybe picking a couple of schools to be pilots for your district process would be a great way to really work out some of the kinks before you went more full scale. Melissa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would agree 1,000% with everything that you know, Chris and Julie and Danielle have been saying. I think the other thing in addition to that is thinking about if you're going to do that kind of systematic rollout, thinking about for those who may not meet that readiness criteria, what are you going to do as a district to help get them ready? Is there an opportunity to invest more resources or more support that's going to help move them from where they are in their readiness journey to meeting that criteria? So it's not an all or nothing kind of thing, but it's not yet. So in between, what can we do to help get you ready? I think there's also something really powerful in what Danielle was saying about selecting a few pilot schools or model demonstration where you can figure out what it's going to take. And if you're doing that not in isolation school by school, but from our district's perspective, then it's easier to take it and grow it across more schools because you've thought about it from a district perspective and not just from those individual student or individual schools.
So aloha to Greg in Hawaii. It's an early morning for you. We appreciate you getting up. But he asked a question, and I saw this pop up through the chat a little bit about some what I would call confusion around what's the difference between SEL, PBIS, MTSS, social skill groups, and so forth. I would sort of characterize it this way. MTSS, PBIS is a problem-solving framework, data practice systems. SEL curriculum specifically are practice. And absolutely, if you see the need within your data for kids who are manifesting and or need some more emotional supports, not only at the universal, but even into tier 2, Lincoln Public School did a great job of embedding a lot of the cognitive behavioral strategies that you oftentimes see in SEL programs within and across their continuum. So they added some of those strategies within their check and check out, for example. So I know there's some confusion, and he indicates that that when COVID hit, they stopped doing kind of behavior and started doing SEL. What I would encourage, Greg, and I'll let Danielle and Melissa and our panelists jump in, is to think about that as one practice, one strategy within your larger MTSS framework, how you differentiate it from universal to tier 2 to tier 3. And as always, making sure your data indicate such a practice, such a curriculum is needed. Danielle, Melissa, anything to add? All right, I got a thumbs up from Danielle, so I guess I've done well.
Well, I would say I agree, and we're doing similar things here in Omaha Public Schools. We are rolling out some new social and emotional learning components, but it's within the framework we've already developed within our MTSSB structures in the building. So having that as part of this framework. I want to recognize our time. We have 2 minutes left, so I want to do a quick summary and make sure you have the evaluation. As we think of this summary, I just want to reiterate how lucky we are in this session to have Melissa joining us for My Blissy, to have Chris and Julie as really great district exemplars. Our content facilitator was one of the co-directors, Dr. Lewis. So really thanks to everyone who made this session a success. And in chat, we had Gordon Way helping us out with data. And if you didn't see it, Dr. Tricia Guffey also put in a link to the Educators Blueprint podcast. It's a podcast out of the MU Center, and it has several really great Tier 2 episodes. So click on that link and you'll be able to hear even more about Tier 2 from more people. So quick summary about those identification systems, Tier 2 being that extension of Tier 1, and really thinking about how can you develop that comprehensive system. Before we get cut off, don't forget to fill out your session evaluation. There are several ways you can do it, and then I know you will also receive an email prompting you to complete it. We definitely want your feedback. So thank you so much for joining us. From Melissa, Chris, Julie, and I, we all appreciate you joining us. And if you have questions after, feel free to email follow up as well.
Thanks, everybody.